Hi everyone, and welcome to this coaching video for task 4B. By listening to this video, or in virtue of listening to this video, it should be the case that you have already downloaded the document that goes with task 4B. This video presupposes that you have read everything in the video for task 4B. What I'm going to do is give you some further clarification, some iteration. I'm going to provide you with with my expectation in terms of something that's not written in the download. So I'm going to add some emphasis I want to add something about emphasis in the context of your question. And then I also want to give you some tips and warnings with respect to how students have missed the mark. Let me turn off this light over here. When it comes to this part of this assignment, keep in mind that everything that you've been learning for task 3A and task 4A and task 4B is information that you will use and apply during Unit 4 as well. Okay, so I'm going to be using my notes here. I might read straight off from them at times, but we shall see. Okay, so coaching for task 4B, again, I am presupposing that you read the download for task 4B. Okay, so your question should show attention to the intellectual and philosophical context of Unit 3. So what was the branch that we explored during Unit 3? It was metaphysics. And as you remember, metaphysics is focused on what primarily? What's the one word that names the most important concept for this branch? Reality. So you learned a little bit, you had some general introduction to metaphysics and how philosophers think about reality in section 2.0. But then you were given special emphasis about reality in the problem of freedom and determinism. Okay, so you want to keep the intellectual, academic, philosophical, and metaphysical context in mind as you're thinking about what you want to focus in on with respect to your peers' argument about free will and wearing a mask in the grocery store, right? And so as you can probably see now, right, there's such a design to my class. So now that you have had a lesson in argument construction, and that helps you to understand what an argument is, how to put one together, the idea is you can also take one apart. So you do your objective analysis. You should have already done that by now or learned about that by now from 4A. But now you're going to ask a question about this argument about free will, right? And now you are better equipped to do so. Why? Because you read about metaphysics and the problem of free will and determinism, and you even tested how much you knew, how much you retained and really internalized about metaphysics and freedom and determinism in virtue of completing the test. So there's definitely a logical structure to the task in this class, and I hope you can appreciate that now. Even the way I talk about the intellectual virtues is fully integrated, and there's a very thoughtful and purposeful design in my curriculum. So as you're thinking about the question, I want you to keep that context in mind. I want you to keep in mind all that you've learned about metaphysics and especially freedom and determinism, the different concepts, the concept of circumstantial freedom, the concept of metaphysical freedom, the concept of the thesis of universal causation and hence determinism as a theory that, everything is the result of a prior cause, the necessary result of a prior cause. Keep in mind, what you learned about the hard determinist and what they think about the three statements that Law had introduced you to in section 2.5 to give you an outline of how he would be approaching and explaining the theories to you. Keep in mind what you learned about libertarianism and agent causation and event causation. Keep in mind what you learned about compatibilism, what I call soft determinism, as you know from one of my lectures embedded in one of the videos for the test prep. Keep in mind, the idea of a free action and an unfree action, of an action that's voluntary and an action that's not voluntary, what that has to do with internal cause and what that has to do with external cause. So keep all of this in mind so that you pick a question that shows that you are thinking in terms of metaphysics, because this is a metaphysical argument. These are metaphysical arguments that you're comparing. You might not have known it at the time, but now I'm sure you can see it. You can see what you explicitly focused on in terms of the metaphysics of the question in the prompt for item 2, but you maybe can better see now more how metaphysics and the philosophical concern with reality, free will, and whatnot is at least implied in your response and your peers' response. So in deciding what kind of a question to formulate, make sure that you think through the lens of a metaphysician. Have that as part of your thinking process, your decision-making process in terms of what question you're going to focus, and of course, what claim you want to focus in on with respect to your peer's response. That is, now that you have some basic insights about the philosophical branch of metaphysics and the problem of determinism and free will, you want you want to think carefully and meaningfully with purpose about your question. Your question that, as you know from reading through the document for this video, you're supposed to use a template. The template's given in page 1 of that download. The template is in the download for task 4B, so you should have read through that as now. And the question that you formulate in virtue of the options that I give you afterwards. So again, this is high-level critical thinking, right? This is a philosophy class. It's supposed to make you think. And so that's what you're doing here. So you're pulling together all your skills, your knowledge of what an argument is, a conclusion, a premise, the idea that the premise is supposed to support the conclusion, your knowledge that the first statement's supposed to be at least a main conclusion. For some of you, it's the only conclusion, but for others, it's the main conclusion in your argument. You're bringing together your knowledge of metaphysics, the problem, and free will, but you're also now using all of that, keeping it in mind as you now use the template for question, contextualization, and generation, right? And keeping all of that in mind as you determine what kind of question do you want to ask your peer. And remember that there's question, I have a lesson on the kinds of questions that you can ask to ask meaningful questions. Make sure that you do not go ahead and answer the question for your peer. That's a huge mistake that some students make. Ask your question, set it up, contextualize it, tell the student why you think it's significant, as I tell you, I tell you to do that in the download, but don't then proceed to answer the question for the student. So that's a mistake that some students have made. Your question should really get your peer to elaborate on something of metaphysical importance. Maybe it's something they said explicitly or something they said implicitly. It should be metaphysically meaningful. It should be, after answering your question, their metaphysical position should be that much more well supported or that much more clear. Or you can think of, in terms of your question, getting your student to, maybe they offered a premise in support of their conclusion. Maybe you want them to focus on supporting one of their premises, to make it more compelling. Maybe there's something implicit, explicit, or whatever, but you want them to focus more on that. Now, that said, a major mistake that some students make is they'll ask students to support their conclusion, but they've already done that. I can guarantee that each and every one of you gave me an argument for this topic where the first sentence was a conclusion, and then you had at least one statement that was a premise. There were a few students who had one or one too many irrelevant statements that didn't function as a premise at all after the first statement, but most of you showed a lot of good attention to the lecture I did on argument construction and the examples where I went over irrelevant statements, logical versus contextual statements after the conclusion. Most of you did a really good job. Just keep in mind that do not focus on having a student, you can't just say, can you please provide more support for your conclusion? That's not going to cut it. You really have to show attention to everything that I've said thus far and what is in the download for the task 4B. Okay. Make sure you don't say anything in the question paragraph that misrepresents what you have learned about metaphysics and free will. If you would like to pull from the reading, like maybe you're thinking, I think Stace would disagree with this based on that. He might ask blah, blah, blah. Or you think maybe Spinoza would disagree, or maybe Spinoza would agree. I'm going to ask him about this. Or, I learned about something called circumstantial metaphysical freedom. I'm going to ask him about that. If you want to do that, that's fine. But make sure that you make sure you cite your source in contextualizing and formulating your question. Make sure that you tell me from what page in the reading you are getting that information, that concept, that definition. If you use a definition from the reading, make sure you give proper citations and acknowledgments for that. Don't just, pull something from the reading and put it there as if it's in your own words. Even if you paraphrase, I need to know at the end of the paragraph or at the end of that sentence, where did you get that paraphrase from? So everything that you learned about metaphysics and free will, it is not common knowledge. It is not common knowledge at all. So anything that you say that is in the reading, you need to make sure you cite it. So it doesn't hurt to oversight. So even if you don't remember that you got this idea or awareness of something from the reading, you should check it, because chances are you did and you need to cite it. So be careful, because you can still plagiarize if you make use of the book in some way to set up, contextualize the question that you post for the peer. But if you do that, again, don't misrepresent or distort if and when you use something from the reading. Also, don't misrepresent or distort what your peer says. Okay, so in contextualizing and formulating your question, you can't make claims about something that are not true with respect to what your peer said. Let's see. Avoid a focus on the trivial things. Again, you want to ask a question that shows attention to the download and what I said about having your metaphysical mindset. Don't ask a student, okay, so I already asked you that one. Okay, make sure the question you ask isn't already explicitly answered. So I've had students that ask a student a question and the student has already answered that question explicitly. So the student will say, I think A because of C, D, E. And then the student will say, do you think that C, D, and E influence your belief in A? And the student says in the paragraph, my belief in A is represented or is influenced by C, D, E. So make sure your question isn't already explicitly answered by the peer. Now, you can ask a question about something that's implied. You think it's implied when you think you're reading between the lines correctly, but you're not sure. I have an example of that in the download. That's okay. But what I'm saying is, don't ask a question that is already explicitly dealt with in the student's response. Okay, I think that's all I have for you. I'm looking forward to reading these questions, these contextualizations for the questions and your response as a whole. Don't forget that the objective analytical paragraph where you focus either on a contrast or a comparison, don't forget that that goes immediately before the paragraph where you contextualize and generate a question. Remember, it's all in the same submission.